Welcome everyone. Salam, Namaste, Adab. Today's topic is on CAA, anti-CAA protest and women's role. Today is Dussehra also, or tomorrow is Dussehra. So a lot of our activist members, probably they are busy in their festival. But Dussehra itself is a reminder to all, is a triumph of goodness over evil. And in many ways, actually, this protest on the street in India last year, before COVID, was actually a struggle on that right path, path of democracy, and where citizens' rights were unchallenged. So today's topic reminds me a lot on Dussehra's mythical outcome. So rather than me going more than this, we have requested Dr. Hashma Hasan for the opening remarks. So let me introduce Dr. Hashma Hasan, who is going to introduce this main speaker. Dr. Hashma Hasan doesn't need much introduction, at least locally here, but for some others, she is a senior scientist at NASA, National Space Organization of USA, and she is a very accomplished scientist. All kind of awards she has gotten. She is a PhD from Oxford, which is in physics, which at that time was really a very rare subject for women going all PhD in physics, and that too from Oxford and Cambridge, like in institutions. So she is sort of role model for many in the female gender or sort of Alivarians. And she also comes from a very distinguished family. She is a maternal niece of Professor Nurul Hasan, who was the education minister during Indira Gandhi's time, and of course from Sajjad Zahir's family. So Dr. Hashim Hasan, please.
Okay, thank you, Razi. Good morning, Assalamu alaikum, adab arz, and namaskar. It is an honor and a pleasure for me today to introduce our distinguished guest, Dr. Zoya Hasan. She's a National Fellow of the Indian Council of Social Science Research, is a Professor Emerita of Political Science and former Dean of School of Social Sciences at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She's also a former member of the National Commission for Minorities. I knew her as well as Mushirul Hasan, who later became her husband, who was a classmate of my sister Khadija when all of us were students at Aligarh. At a time when very few Indian women and even fewer Muslim women acquired higher education, Zoya took the bold step of going abroad and obtaining a doctorate in political science from Pennsylvania State University, United States. She went on to be a leader in her field, doing path-breaking work on the social and educational aspects of Indian Muslims and Muslim women, as well as on Indian government and politics. She has authored and edited 11 books and several articles. Today, we stand at the brink of a monumental change threatening the very foundations of Indian democracy as a result of the Citizen Amendment Act, or CAA. CAA not only violently discriminates against Muslims, rather strikes a shattering blow at the very heart of the Indian Constitution, which grants equality to all, irrespective of religion. The introduction of CAA in December 2019 led to mass protests across the country, mobilizing, amongst others, women in a powerful way. Today, Dr. Hasan will address this particular aspect of the CAA protests in her talk, Occupying Streets, Women in the Vanguard of the Anti-CAA Protests. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Dr. Zoya Hasan.
Thank you. Let me begin by thanking Hashma Hasan and Dr. Raziuddin and the Indian Diaspora in Washington DC for inviting me to give a talk. Given the galaxy of speakers who have preceded me in giving talks in this particular forum, it is indeed a great honor and pleasure to have the opportunity of talking to the Washington DC Metro event. Now, as Hashma has very nicely sort of set up, so to speak, the context of this talk, my talk is a broad discussion of the public protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act in late 2019 and early 2020. It was a remarkable protest, one of the biggest and most important in independent India. And I believe it deserves to be examined and discussed regardless of the eventual outcome. That is to say, whether the Supreme Court upholds it or not, and whether this is withdrawn or not withdrawn and will eventually be implemented. As I said, regardless of the outcome, I think it is important for us to understand this extremely important political moment in our contemporary history in India, because, as I said, this is an important movement. This was a very significant movement, but it was also very different for several reasons, which I will briefly outline and analyze in this lecture. Now, from the middle of December 2019, Shaheen Bagh emerged as a nationwide symbol of resistance against the Citizenship Amendment Act, the National Register of Citizens, the NRC, and the National Population Register, the NPR. A combination of law, policy, and census exercise designed to undermine, as Hashma, I think, just stated, the secular foundations of the Indian polity and, above all, of the Indian Constitution. Shaheen Bagh became the epicenter from where the protests spread to towns and cities across the country. There were numerous demonstrations, marches, sit-ins, Occupy actions by citizens, initiated to start with by university students, and I'm delighted to say that it actually, in a sense, started with two institutions that I have been associated with, the Jawaharlal Nehru University, where I taught for 40 years, and the Jamia Millia Islamia, where my husband taught history for many years and was subsequently the Vice Chancellor of that institution. So in a way, these two institutions really led the way for this movement. Now, judging by the countrywide protests, it is clear that people recognized that the CAA implies a foundational shift in the conception of the Indian citizen embodied in the Constitution of India, which has been the basis for citizenship, which follows upon the Citizenship Act of 1955. The CAA of 2019 marks a shift from a religion-neutral law to a law that differentiates based on religious identity. This is the basic issue and the basic problem. From a political perspective, it marks a shift from a territorial idea of India to an ethno-religious idea of India. This signals a move towards the institution of a Hindu state in India. Now, what exactly is the nature of the law that is being resisted? or that was being resisted. The CAA essentially set up a process to fast-track the possibility of obtaining Indian citizenship for 6 designated groups from 3 neighboring Muslim majority countries, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan. The Act further reduces the period of time required for naturalization for 6 communities, all non-Muslim, of course, Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Jain, Parsi, and Christian immigrants who arrived in India before 31st December 2014 from these countries. The cabinet at the same time had also approved the creation of the NPR, which will document all Indian residents, citizens and non-citizens alike. Now the CAA, and that's the key point, which is what caused so much worry and concern and opposition. The CAA is not a standalone law. It is closely related to a key project of the ruling party, namely the NRC. The Home Minister, Mr. Amit Shah, had repeatedly underscored 2 things. One, the NRC exercise conducted in Assam in 2019 will be extended to the rest of India. And 2, the CAA will be implemented first, and only after that, the NRC. Understand the chronology, he said quite plainly, and from that time, this has become, as it were, a statement to, in a sense, a statement to oppose it, because he clearly sort of laid out the plan quite openly, so to speak. As the NRC will divide the people domiciled in India into 2 categories, citizens and illegal migrants. The CAA will safeguard the citizenship of all Indians except Muslims. Of course, we are now talking essentially of migrants. Therefore, the CAA will act as a safety net that will ensure citizenship of all non-Muslims and not just the lakhs of Hindus declared illegal migrants from the NRC exercise in Assam, something that the BJP had not expected, because it ended up actually creating a situation where there are more Hindus who've been declared as illegal, so to speak, than even Muslims. Now, of course, it remains to be seen what rules and procedures the government will specify for the CAA process, but it is likely that there will be a lower threshold for these illegal migrants to establish their Indian citizenship. Moreover, and this is the point, these individuals can take recourse to CAA in the event that they do not have the relevant papers and they're not able to establish their citizenship. The same option is not available to Muslims who failed to make it in the NRC. Thus, it is the combination of CAA and NRC that would potentially discriminate against Muslims. Now, 3 core elements of the CAA directly compromise and breach India's constitutional commitment to secularism, liberty, and equality. First, the CAA directly contradicts the fundamental rights enshrined in India's constitution, especially Article 14 and Article 21, which guarantee equality before the law and the right to life, respectively. Secondly, while it claims to grant citizenship to all religious minorities from Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh, the Act excludes, as we have seen, persecuted minority Muslim groups from these countries. It does not provide citizenship to persecuted minority communities from other neighboring countries and regions such as Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Myanmar, or Nepal. For example, the Rohingyas of Myanmar therefore can find no home in India. In short, the CAA brazenly violates the Constitution in introducing a religious test of citizenship. Thirdly, the CAA combined with NRC will require even existing citizens to prove their citizenship through appropriate documents in case some doubts are raised about their status, so to speak. Now, this strategy, I argue, needs to be seen in the larger context of politics in India today and government's policies towards minorities, reflected, number one, in the criminalization of triple talaq, the abrogation of Article 370 in Jammu and Kashmir, and the clampdown in that state or in the Kashmir Valley since August of 2019, and of course, starting the construction of the Ram Temple in Ayodhya. I would argue that that in a way, CAA is going even beyond this, because CAA is perhaps the most explicit attempt to push forward a majoritarian agenda, or as I said earlier, the possibility of actually establishing a Hindu state. The Home Minister's repeated assertion in Parliament during the passage of this bill, saying that this bill is part of, to quote him, the unfinished business of partition, unequivocally underlined the majoritarian agenda. The business of righting the wrongs of partition goes against the categorical rejection of the two-nation theory by India's freedom struggle and the secular and constitutional framework that India adopted despite the surcharged political circumstances in the aftermath of partition. In fact, it validates the two-nation theory by introducing a religious criterion of citizenship. And it really goes against India's, sort of post-independence history, so to speak. Now, now, from this, then I move on to the protests against this background. Now, the passage of CAA and the countrywide protests against it proved to be an important turning point in India's democracy. After the smooth passage of the CAA in Parliament by the BJP-led NDA government, the BJP had clearly not anticipated what was to follow or what would follow. In the normal course of things, once a law is passed by Parliament, it is expected that things would settle down. Even political parties which had misgivings about the new law were not ready or willing to really openly oppose it, or leave alone launching a protest against it. A few of BJP's allies had spoken out against the bill, but in the end voted for it in Parliament. However, the countrywide protest broke out from mid-December 2019 and continued till the end of January 2020 in different parts of the country, which clearly took the government by complete surprise. The CAA and the proposal to create an NRC provoked, as I said, massive protests, by far the biggest protest since independence. The protests attracted, and the interesting thing was that these protests attracted people with from a wide range of communities, political affiliations, and ideologies, implicitly demonstrating that the CAA placed them all at risk and not just Muslims. The early sign of public opposition against the CAA, as I said in my opening remarks, was displayed by students of Jamia Millia and Jawaharlal Nehru University, and also Aligarh Muslim University. In both JMI and AMU campuses, state action rained heavily on students on 15 December as police officials stormed the respective campuses. The police brutality was particularly shocking in the Jamia campus, so much so that they even entered the library, and this gave momentum to a wave of protests across India. A spontaneous midnight demonstration by students from the Jawaharlal Nehru University and also by some students from Delhi University that night itself, that is the night of 15 December, in front of the police headquarters at the ITO crossing marked something of a beginning. In the next few days, students from universities all over the country began demonstrating in solidarity with their fellow students in Jamia Millia and AMU. The spark was really lit by protests in Jamia, which actually took the country by storm. They really took the lead. Following the police crackdown in Jamia, protests swelled into a movement. Tens of thousands of people came out on the streets in numerous cities, universities, public squares, maidans to express their opposition. What was remarkable, I think, was the social inclusiveness on display, as students from different religious backgrounds were fighting alongside Muslim students. So it was clear from the very beginning that this was not about religion, even though the government made every attempt to give it a Muslim color. And yet it was clear that this was not really not a Muslim only protest. Even in minority educational institutions, the anti-CAA protests, and at this point I do wish to underline that even in minority educational institutions such as Jamia Millia and AMU, the anti-CAA protests were taking place outside the boundaries of identity politics, with young men and women, especially at Jamia, articulating their rights as citizens. In short, people from all walks of life across religious, social, linguistic, and professional boundaries joined these demonstrations. And students, including those from elite universities, management schools, IITs, came out in support. Soon enough, these protests engulfed the entire nation. Of course, there's no doubt and there's no denying that Muslims who feel most threatened by this move and were most anxious were clearly in the forefront of these protests. But these protests was not a fight for Muslim rights, even by Muslims, so to speak. It was a fight for the secular, for the right to have rights, which is what citizenship is all about, for the right of belonging, and most significantly, for the defense of the Constitution and constitutional patriotism. Importantly, these protests were spontaneous. Unlike previous big protests, such as the JP movement of the 1970s or the more recent anti-corruption movement of 2012-13, these protests were not led or directed by politicians, political parties, or larger-than-life activists like Anna Hazare, for example. This time, diverse civil society organizations and public-spirited individuals led the protests, with the partial exception of West Bengal and Kerala, where political parties were actively backing and sometimes even leading the protests or sustaining these protests. In fact, even in Calcutta, a placard outside the Park Circus Maidan read, "No CAA. Welcome to Park Circus. Kindly leave your political party affiliation and banner outside the gate." Now, the second very striking thing about these protests is this, that mass protests worldwide, and in India, of course, involve, in India in particular, I should say, involve an assertion of the interests of beleaguered groups and marginalized identities. But those protesting against the CAA were not driven by self-interest. I think this was the most attractive aspect of these protests. They weren't demanding, the protesters weren't demanding, for example, reservations or jobs. In other words, people on the street who rejected the CAA were not there for sectional or sectarian reasons, but to fight for an ideal of equality articulated during India's nationalist movement and formalized in the Constitution. Moreover, many of the protesters, and this is again an important point to note, many of the protesters were unlikely to be affected by the CAA or even the NRC. Yet they were protesting to make a point of upholding the principles of equality, dignity, and solidarity. The government made, as I said, the government made every attempt to suppress these protests, to quash these protests with bans on gatherings, imposition of Section 144, arrests of activists, insisting that they not disallowing gatherings of more than 4 people, and of course, considerable police violence. I don't really have the time to go into it, but nowhere was police violence greater than in UP. Now, nonetheless, the protesters were not deterred, and protests continued, as I said, for about 2 months. Now, most remarkably, the loudest voices of dissent and opposition came from women. Everywhere it was women who were in the vanguard, which is the title of my talk. India had not seen such a sustained mobilization of women, nor have we ever seen this scale of mobilization around non-gender issues, and in complete defiance of state and police action across the country. It was striking that women were out on the streets for a cause that was not women-specific, not about sexual harassment, not against rape or domestic violence, and so on. Women were the life and soul of resistance against this law that undermines all the principles and principles articulated in the preamble of the Constitution. In protest after protest, it was women who were shouting Azadi slogans and Inqilab Zindabad, invoking the Samvidhan, that is the Constitution, singing the national anthem, or Sare Jahan Se Acha Hindustan Hamara, and of course Faiz Ahmad Faiz's revolutionary poem, Hum Dekhenge, virtually became the anthem of these protests. So in their breadth and depth, these protests remind us of the freedom struggle, when large numbers of women responded to Mahatma Gandhi's call to participate in the national movement. Women from all backgrounds came onto the streets to lend heft to the national movement at crucial moments. In August 1942, Gandhi gave his final call to the nation to rise up against the British at the Gwalior Tank Maidan in Bombay. When the Quit India protest began, the British, as we know, arrested Gandhi and other prominent Congress leaders. It was then that a young freedom fighter, Aruna Asif Ali, who unfurled the national flag at the Gwalior Tank Maidan, galvanizing millions with this powerful act of protest before she went underground. In the weeks that followed, women played a very significant role in continuing the Quit India movement. But there's one difference between the participation of women then during the freedom struggle and the anti-CAA protests. This time, women were not just responding to the call of male leaders, they were the leaders. Now, these protests were momentous also because of the huge and active participation of Muslim women. They really led from the front. They virtually dominated the movement, so to speak. And in so doing, they shattered many stereotypes about Muslim women. It put paid to the pervasive belief that the average Indian Muslim woman is uneducated and burqa-clad figure who has no voice and is suffering under patriarchal oppression. Muslim women were clearly in the vanguard of these protests, and no one would have expected such a significant and sustained participation from them. And I said, they mixed very well with women from different backgrounds, from different classes, communities, as someone rather eloquently commented, spaghetti straps mingled with sherwanis is how one report described a mixed group of modern, westernized young women rubbing shoulders with older, traditional-looking women. Now, of course, the political, and I won't go into the details because I think this is quite well known. The story of Shaheen Bagh is so well documented now, and much has been written about it. There are already 2 or 3 books that have been published on Shaheen Bagh. But clearly, the political assertion of Muslim women was epitomized by the protests in Shaheen Bagh when hundreds of women blocked a main road and began a sit-in against the CAA. And to protest against the police violence in Jamia Millia. Now, this sit-in attracted thousands of people from different backgrounds. It almost became a pilgrimage site that if you haven't been to Shaheen Bagh, then there's something that you haven't done and that you must do. So it drew people from all across the city and later on from all across the country, from all age groups, classes, communities. And it is this multiplicity. And Asima Mustafa, in a book that a collection of essays that she has edited called Shaheen Bagh, The Idea of India, very rightly points out that it is the multiplicity and the inclusiveness of Shaheen Bagh that gave strength to the anti-CAA resistance. Now, Shaheen Bagh then became an iconic symbol, a prime metaphor of national protest against the new citizenship laws. As Kanhaiya Kumar, one of the sort of leading student activists, now of course a full-time politician, said that the fire started by women at Shaheen Bagh is no longer limited to Delhi. It had spread all over India, and indeed, demonstrations that took place in all sites across the country, from Delhi, UP, Bihar, Jharkhand, West Bengal, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Telangana, Karnataka, and Kerala. Now, so it was therefore not just Shaheen Bagh, but all of these cities, states and cities across the country. Never before in India, Muslim women had come out in such large numbers to protest and demand their rights and to demand equality, whether constitutional or in any other way. In fact, after the Supreme Court had delivered its verdict in the famous Shabano case, in that whole maintenance controversy, of course, the country had witnessed many agitations, and many Muslim women, conservative Muslim women, did participate in those agitations, demanding that the Shabano verdict should be overturned, so to speak, or opposing the apex court's decisions. But then they were participating at the behest of male leaders, of clerics, and so on. This time, Muslim women were out there on their own, fighting for their rights, and not at all under the leadership of men. In fact, there are, I don't really have the time, there are several instances where, in fact, for example, in Kanpur and in Saharanpur and so on, I mean, the Qazis and so on were quite taken aback that even though they were sometimes asking Muslim women to go back home and not to persist with this agitation, they refused. They were quite defiant. And in fact, one of the Qazis, I think, possibly in Kanpur, said earlier people would listen to Qazis, but now people are calling us Dallals and Mukhbirs. I cannot understand what has happened. Why are they not listening to us anymore? So throughout then, women were defiant in their protests against CAA while taking on the national government in some places, and as I just pointed out, the quote, defying local power structures and religious hierarchies. Now, what is remarkable about the high visibility of Muslim voices in the protests and rallies is, as I said, that they eschewed community-specific positions, because they were not just demanding azadi for Muslim women. They were demanding azadi for all women and for everyone, not even just women, so to speak. And in fact, they repeatedly said that we are out here not for any community specific issue. It is about the very existence of Indians and the Constitution. And one of them said, if the Constitution is safe, so are Muslims, Hindus, and Christians. Now, it is this approach which, in a way, widened the discussion. This enabled a discussion of wider issues, which has contributed to broadening the notion of rights. And I would argue, and I think this is again the very nice part of these protests, was that these protests opened a new world for Muslim women, one where they are seen and heard and taken seriously for what they are, for what they were saying, for what they were organizing, and how they were able to sort of mobilize other women, and in many cases men as well. So it gave Muslim women a voice and agency that they were previously lacking. For many women, these protests were therefore a life-changing event, particularly for women from the margins, from the weaker sections. Moreover, this time, as I said, Muslim women were not responding to the call of male leaders at all. Even when the movement began losing steam in the latter half of January of this year, with the government's rigid stance and with the government saying that it's not going to move an inch, I think the innovative and courageous nature of women's protests lent immense democratic credibility and voice to these protests. This brings me to two more points before I close, which is that through these protests, I think, and that is again an important aspect, which is that in a way, women were claiming their rights, of course, as I just outlined, but they were also claiming the nation. That is, nation is usually a rather remote entity, removed from everyday experience. Women know intuitively and experientially what it means to be displaced, to be rendered homeless, and repeated and egregious references to partition's unfinished business by the proponents of this law resurrected the long dormant fears of destitution, displacement, and violence that wreaks havoc in very particular ways on women. And that's part of the reason why they were in the lead. So Muslim women, interestingly, were very vocal in asserting their belonging to the nation based on their deep association with this land, the land of their birth. And therefore, on Republic Day this year, celebrations in different in different cities or in different protest sites, of course, most notably in Shaheen Bagh and various other places, again in Park Circus and so on. One of the activists who was writing about it put it very nicely. She said, "A republic truly comes of age when its women claim it." And the 71st Republic Day in 2019 marked a proud year for this nation when its republic truly came of age, when millions of women began to insist that the state is a matter of res publica, that is a public affair, and not the private estate of rulers to decree as they please. Then it marks, she said, a turning point in the history of the nation. When women take over public spaces in small towns and big cities across the country with the power that we are witnessing today, then theirs is a force not to be underestimated. And when they claim in unison that it is their historical rooting in the soil of Hindustan that will determine their nationality as well as the place of their graves, then the authority of papers indeed does seem to decline. I think she has put it really beautifully and captured very nicely the sentiment that was powering these protests. Now, the second point that with regard to why these protests were important and why women were right up there in front, is the whole issue of non-discrimination, which is that what had also brought women from different ages and communities together is the experience and apprehension of discrimination. Women's decision to occupy public spaces through a sit-in reflected their experiences of poverty, displacement, and gender-based exclusion. It actually became a catalyst for opposing their daily experiences of fear because of their clothing or because of their veil or hijab or names as markers of their identity and so on. So women were against CAA because it poses an existential threat of disenfranchisement, detention, and deportation. The question of who belongs being decided on the basis of citizenship defined by documentary evidence creates a threat to the very foundations of their existence. As a young homemaker on a round-the-clock vigil against the CAA, NRC, NPR, told the Telegraph newspaper of Calcutta, her vigil, and she put it so well, her vigil was a struggle for existence. And her name was Rizwana Bibi. She is a daily wage laborer. And she later told the Telegraph that she was losing pay, by being at the protest site, but she had no choice because she was scared of what the law could entail for her and her family. At a practical level, we know, and so many studies have shown this, that women, especially poorer women, are likely to suffer disproportionately from the CAA and NRC, which require documents that most of them would not have. It is well known that many of the women who have been excluded from the NRC, for example, many of the people who have been excluded from the NRC in Assam are women. So it is well known that women generally tend to have less documentation in our deeply patriarchal society and political and bureaucratic culture, and thus are more excluded from the ambit of governance and administration. With lower literacy rates than men, most Indian women lack documents they need, specifically education certificates and land titles, because they do not have land ownership rights. So in a sense, one could argue that what was again very significant about these protests was that it was, without actually saying so, focused on the right to non-discrimination, which is Article 16 of the Constitution, besides fighting for the right to equality under Article 14. So in a way, the way in which the street protests posed this question was really around the whole issue of non-discrimination, dignity, justice, and of course, equality. Now, women's mobilization, and this is really the third point, which is that women's mobilization was driven then, as I've argued, by a strong democratic spirit and the belief that the changes in the citizenship law undermine the Constitution. For this reason, they had chosen the Constitution itself as the instrument to assert their citizenship as Indians. For them, citizenship is something basic that comes before everything else. It is distinct from and deeper than political rights or voting alone, and is therefore embedded and is embedded as a birthright, so to speak. As one of them said, at a protest site, we are voters on the day of voting, but we are citizens every day. It is this fundamental notion of citizenship that women were seeking to reclaim, the idea of citizenship as birthright. Consequently, and very importantly, the Constitution itself became the instrument, the Constitution of India became the instrument. But again, Constitution, like the nation, is hardly a document that we read every day, and even its preamble is little known to most of us. It exists mostly in the abstraction, a reassuring guarantee of protection from discrimination and injustice. Never before had its defense ever made for the kind of protests we saw during these anti-CAA protests. Now, women's resistance was particularly forceful in bringing renewed attention to the Constitution. And for the first time since the founding of the Republic, the Constitution became the center of public debate. Save the Constitution was a rallying call that defined public conversations at all protest sites. This call testified to the significance of the Constitution and how much we are shaped by it and why it can be used to challenge the majoritarian authoritarian government that we have today. Thus, on the steps of the Jama Masjid in Delhi and at the makeshift stage at Shaheen Bagh, women held aloft Bharat Ka Samvidhan. That was the most prominent poster, so to speak, and everything else was really around the Constitution, so to speak. And during the protest then, the preamble was being photocopied, being distributed, being read out, it was being displayed by protesters just about everywhere. The mass reading of the preamble was really the most beautiful part of these protests, and it revealed a much deeper public engagement with the Constitution than is commonly thought or than we commonly believe. By reading the preamble to the Constitution, hoisting the Tiranga, and singing the national anthem, the women at the center of the anti-CAA protests empowered Indian democracy in a way few people had imagined before this. Finally, then, in conclusion, what do we say about the outcomes and where do we stand and what is really the significance of the protest? Because in the end, even after 2 months of protests, obviously the CAA was not withdrawn. Now, ever since the Black Lives Movement took the United States by storm, there have been numerous comparisons between the Black Lives Movement protests and the anti-CAA protests in India. According to the New York Times, the Black Lives Movement protests took place in 2,000 American cities. By comparison, of course, the scale and spread of the anti-CAA movement was modest. But this was still that is to say, the anti-CAA protest was still a very significant protest for two reasons. For the first time, there was a sustained protest by Muslims who had been very reticent and afraid of speaking up, leave alone protesting against discrimination, which is clearly sharpened under the current regime. The second reason is, and I really wish to emphasize this, even though there's so many Muslim activists and scholars who would probably disagree with me, and the point I want to emphasize is that a large number of non-Muslims participated in these protests, and I think we should not. We must recognize this. And this, I think, marks a major shift in protest politics in India or protest movements in India. And it is for these two reasons, I argue, that the government was extremely worried about these protests and hence did everything possible to discredit the movement, and eventually, of course, it broke up. Now, as we know, the protests ended in unexpected circumstances caused by the national lockdown and the fear of the coronavirus. No matter how the protests ended, it was successful in mainstreaming a political critique of discrimination. True, they did not persuade the government to withdraw the CAA, but the protests visibly put the BJP-led NDA government on the back foot, on the defensive. To counter it, the BJP had to launch a countrywide blitz to defend the CAA. And despite the government's stand of not budging an inch, the Prime Minister announced that the issue of NRC is not on the table at the moment. A host of ministers had to clarify from multiple platforms that the CAA will not affect Indian Muslims. Also, and very importantly, there are clear signs that these protests may have stalled its implementations. And to this day, it's almost it's 11 months since this law was passed by Parliament. Rules have not yet been framed, even though, as I said, this law was passed in December of 2019. And finally, then, it has forced the government into courts and has forced judicial deliberation on the reach of constitutional protections that are available to citizens so as to discipline and restrain the state, so to speak. Although we have seen a deferral of hearings on the petitions challenging the CAA in the Supreme Court is yet to start hearings on this. Now we are told that hearings will begin in the second week of November. But the fact is that that the Supreme Court will have to examine whether the CAA constitutes a violation of the basic structure doctrine, which is what is at stake. Thanks to the protests, this issue of the basic structure doctrine has to be examined and has to be examined. Now, the basic structure doctrine is the notion that secularism is a basic feature of our Constitution, which explicitly and implicitly prevents the state from identifying itself or favoring any particular religion or religious sect or religions. Ultimately, the outcome of the case in the Supreme Court will have a huge bearing on the future of India's democracy and the future of secularism. Thank you very much.
Wonderful speech indeed. And it was so timely, and we really revisited sort of on CAA movement. And there's no doubt that this corona pandemic, at least for this present government, was a godsend thing. Otherwise, anti-CAA movement was really capturing them. So now, Rafat will take over on this question and answer session, and he as usual will detail you how to do, what to do. Rafat, please.
Thank you, Razi Bhai. Thank you, Professor Hasan. What an amazing talk, outlining intricacies of CA in a simple and clear language. So the forum is open for the question and answer session. And there are two ways or two options. Either you can raise your digital hand or put your comment or your name in the chat box, and I will follow that. So the first question or raise hand by Dr. Taura Khwaja. Taura apa?
जी बताएं.
Taura apa?
if she
Okay,
don't.
so we will wait for her if she shows up. Next is Dr. Fazal Khan. Fazal bhai, unmute.
Okay.
I'm unmuted. Can I talk?
I am unmuted now.
All right. Next.
All right. So, Dr. Hasan, first, thank you for explaining it in a simple term very clearly. I think even a layman can understand. And you are professor, so expected of you probably to explain it in a simple terms. I have two questions actually. One is that the first statement may be it's credit goes to Modi ji and Amit Shah ji to wake women up by their actions. Otherwise, Muslims or other minorities were sleeping, and probably they had enough from Babri Masjid to 370 to triple talaq. So the day came. The second question actually is that do you think that, or have you seen, or anybody has done any survey in India that Shaheen Bagh and protests like that has gone or filtered through down in the general masses? Because idea of India or saving the constitution, probably it is more suitable for minorities, including Muslim, of course. But have the masses realized because of this protest or because of any action by anyone?
Should I respond or we wait for?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. Two questions. One, your point about credit must go to this government, especially the Prime Minister and the Home Minister. I think you're absolutely right that they did. Some credit must go to them for awakening people, but I wouldn't say that people were sleeping until then, or Muslims were sleeping until then. I think they were perfectly aware of what is going on, but it is perhaps the fear factor which was standing in the way of protesting. But as you hinted, the Citizenship Amendment Act, and especially the NRC and the NPR and the possibility of mass exclusions surely triggered this. But you see, the point is that it's not only Muslims who were not protesting for the last 5 or 6 years. There's a general, there's been there's a general fear that was preventing protests. And I think the important thing about these anti-CAA protests was that it lifted the fear, that despite attempts to suppress, despite imposition of Section 144, and despite the very authoritarian methods that were being used and so on, and police violence, people still persisted. So in a way, that fear which was preventing people from taking on the government, I think that fear to some extent went away. But as you very rightly said, that clearly the coronavirus and the lockdown then came at a time that unfortunately, that in a way, once again put back, so to speak, these protests. Your point about mass support, well, I think I have tried to suggest that, there was cross-community, cross-class, cross-regional support. If we look at the geography of protests, it's very clear that this was not middle-class dominated protests, as, for example, the anti-corruption movement was, or the JP movement in the 1970s. This was, a lot of poor people participated in this movement. So in a way, this move, the protests saw the participation or witnessed the participation of a very wide range of people, and I think that is why it is significant. Now, there are, for example, there are suggestions and estimates, I should say, that at least well until early January, for about three to 4 weeks, the participation, if we look at Muslim, non-Muslim participation in these protests, 60% was perhaps Muslim, but 40% were non-Muslims. So that gives you an idea that it was certainly, and the participation of Sikhs and Dalits and so on was very, very large. So in that, now if Dalits and Adivasis and so on are participating in this movement, then we can be pretty sure that there was mass support.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hasan. I see that Dr. Tahura Khwaja is there. Unmute yourself, Kalim Bhai. Unmute yourself. No? Okay, take your time. We will come back. Okay, now is good. Taurapa is good now.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum, Professor Hasan. Very enlightening talk. I want to ask you a question. In this very meaningful presentation, you never said that this was a Indian Muslim feminist movement, which it was. Now look at America. When Trump was elected in January 2017, when he took oath of office, the next day, the women of America, feminist women, they held a strong protest rally in Washington, and it was led by Linda Sarsour, who is a Muslim American woman. So now in India, in the National Committee of Women and other places, we hardly ever see any women. There are a few like you, but in general, we don't see any. So this is the first time in the Shaheen Bagh case that we saw some women, Muslim women. So I would like you to tell us about. I would like you to tell us about the Indian Muslim feminist movement.
I think in my talk, I clearly highlighted the huge participation of women and of Muslim women in particular. In fact, I went to the extent of suggesting that Muslim women were the soul, heart and soul of this movement. So there is no denying that Muslim women were in the forefront of this movement. They led this movement, and I think I have emphasized that this was perhaps the first movement where women and Muslim women in particular were the leaders. They were not being led and being mobilized. They were the leaders. They were mobilizing. So the extraordinary significance of Muslim women is certainly a very important part. But I think at the same time, we must also recognize that there were many others who participated, non-Muslims participated. And my argument is that if we really want to take this forward, then it can't be just by Muslims, about Muslims, and for Muslims. It has to be a cross-community movement. Then only would it command recognition, respect, and legitimacy. And therefore, I think we should not. While we must highlight and recognize the role of Muslims and Muslim women, but equally we must recognize the role of others. And that is, and I think, and the whole point is that if we see it only as a Muslim movement, then we are in a way falling into the ruling party's trap. because the ruling party's whole point and argument throughout has been that this is only that this was a Muslim-led movement, and this was, and so on and so forth, and so much so that they have even called Shaheen Bagh and all of this a conspiracy against the government, and so on and so forth. So I'm not for a moment underplaying the significance. Now, whether there is an Indian Muslim feminist movement, there's certainly, I mean, beyond this and before this, and after this, I suppose, clearly, Muslim women's activism is not a force to reckon with. It was a force to reckon with in the anti-CAA movement. But yes, Muslim women's activism has been significant in pushing for the abolition of triple talaq. In fact, without Muslim women's activism and the role played by 2 or 3 Muslim women's organizations in Bombay, Hyderabad, and so on, the triple talaq, the demand for the abolition of triple talaq would not have gained momentum. In a way, it was Muslim women's activism that gave BJP the strength to push ahead with, by introducing that new act. But I wouldn't say that Muslim women's act, I mean, it is important, it is significant, but I have to confess that I'm not really so familiar with Islamic activism and so on, so I'm not really in a position to comment on those aspects, although that is probably also there.
Thank you, Professor Hasan. There are many people lined up, so please be brief in asking the question as well as the response. And Dr. Aslam,
certainly.
Aslam Azad.
Rafat, Dr. Iqbal Ali is waiting for you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you, Razi.
Okay,
thank you.
Dr. Hasan.
Thank you, Dr. Zoya Hasan, for your enlightening talk. This is Aslam Azad.
Hold on.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, please go ahead, Aslam Saab.
Yes, this is Aslam Azad, and my question is, what is the current status of anti-CAA cases being heard in the Supreme Court of India as of now? Will you please share information with us if you have any? Thank you.
Sorry, what is the question? What is the
status of CAA?
What is the current status of anti-CAA cases?
The current status is that there are several petitions before the Supreme Court challenging the validity of this act on grounds that it violates the basic equality provisions of the Constitution and the non-discrimination provisions of the Constitution. As I said in conclusion, the Supreme Court is likely to, I think a date has been announced that they will start their hearings, if I'm not mistaken, on the 7th or the 9th of November. So in about 2 weeks from now, the hearings on this will begin.
Thank you. So next one is Tariq Farooqi, and after that is Dr. Farah Usmani. So please be ready. So Tariq Farooqi Saab.
Thank you very much, Zoya, for a wonderful talk and very relevant talk. My question is, will this movement, especially led by women, lead to permanent change in the status of Indian women in general and Muslim women in particular? And the second part is, what do you see going forward? Can they take the leadership away from the clerics as well as conservative men?
Great.
I think they're very important questions, both of them. But I think I'll focus on the second part of your first question, whether this will bring about permanent change in the status of Muslim women in particular. Now, it's too early to say that because, let's face it, patriarchy reigns supreme, particularly in Muslim society and in Muslim communities. And one movement is not enough to break the walls of patriarchy. But the fact that so many women did come out and participate in this movement, I think is a step forward. But ultimately, I think what will really bring about change is education. And obviously, we need much greater emphasis on Muslim women's education and on Muslim women's employment, because it's only if they have education and they have employment outside the house that that will bring about change. Your second, I'm sorry, what was the second one? Second question?
Take the leadership away, perhaps a little bit anyway.
Oh, yes, that's very important. Yes, whether it would take the leadership away from clerics. Well, this movement certainly gave a resounding answer, and the resounding answer was yes, because because in several places, clerics were mobilized by the government to stop women from protesting or asking them to go back, but they defied that. So I think that may well have happened. That may well have happened. I doubt if we will see something like what we saw during the anti-Shabano movement, which was led by clerics and, of course, Muslim politicians. So in that sense, I think this is what you have just said, I think is very significant. This might well be one of the most significant changes that this movement may have brought about, which is it has sort of taken away the leadership from the clerics.
That would be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Hasan. So Dr. Raziuddin wants to say something, and then we will come back to the question and answer session. And the next person will be Dr. Farah Usmani.
Yeah, sorry for interruption. Just to acknowledge a very respectable attendee here, Professor Romila Thapar from JNU is here, and
wow.
He hardly needs any introduction.
Wonderful. How very wonderful.
And she is actually one.
I'm delighted. I have the greatest regard and respect for Professor Romila Thapar, as all of us do, of course.
Yes. So she is scheduled, but she's too busy. So most likely she will do a talk most likely in March. But she has committed that in spite of her busy life, she will just do a talk in March. So thank you for participating.
Thank you.
And also just to announce before others get involved, next week we are not doing, this is the first time on any Saturday or weekend that we are not doing a show, because Aligarh Alumni Association, my association, has the annual Mushara, and because of that we don't have any scheduled. And next to that will be a very famous another person, Dr. Gohar Raza will do a presentation on assault on scientific rationality in India. So that will be on November 8th, Sunday. Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Razi bhai. Okay, let's move on. Sir, Dr. Farah Usmani, and after that, Dr. Iqbal Ali.
Iqbal.
Sarshad.
Okay, Rafat, move towards.
Go ahead, Dr. Farah Usmani. Do I have to unmute you? Okay, now you are unmuted. Go ahead, Dr.
Yeah,
Farah.
thank you. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Hasan. Nice to meet you virtually. And really, I liked your analysis, particularly in the, in the different segments, looking at the constitutions, looking at globally, etc. My question or thought is that, what do you see for the future of the movement? What would you advise, including during the COVID period? And so that, the momentum is kept. We know that because of COVID, suddenly it had to be, stopped and moved out. But what we can, do during this period, and how to then evolve it to the next stage and keep the momentum. I like your point also about, integrating with other communities, including Dalits and other marginalized, and keeping the constitution at the center. But I think even during this COVID period, there can be some things that can be supported to strategize for the future. So that's my question.
I think you have a point that perhaps this is the time to revive the movement, especially because the matter is coming up in the Supreme Court and hearings are going to start. This might just be, some kind of public pressure once again could have some bearing on the proceedings in the Supreme Court. And also, yes, I mean, you're right, COVID restrictions are there. But over the last couple of weeks on other issues, not on the CAA, there have been protests, for example, on the farmers issue and the new farm laws that the government passed in the last Parliament session. There's been a great deal of opposition on the Hathras rape case. There was enormous mobilization in different parts of the country. I mean, there was a national outrage and mobilization, especially in Delhi. So there's every reason to expect that it is possible now to mobilize on this. And I think you actually, now that you've raised the issue, I think this is really the time to revive it, precisely because of the Supreme Court hearings.
Thank you, Prof. Iqbal Apa, please go ahead. After that, Sarshar Mustafa.
First of all, Dr. Hasan, thank you so much for such an engaging, informative, and impressive talk. All the relevant and important questions have been asked. I have just one quick question for you. It is a matter of pride to see women like you in the forefront. So have you been leading any of these protests, or have you been actively involved in this?
No, I wasn't at all leading, but I did visit Shaheen Bagh a couple of times. I mean, literally just to see what was going. And as I said in my talk, not going to Shaheen Bagh would have been, I mean, something that I wouldn't have forgiven myself if I hadn't made a couple of trips to Shaheen Bagh. And I also went, just as a participant in a couple of other protests in Jantar Mantar and several others, but just as one of thousands who were going there. But I was certainly not leading and certainly not organizing, mobilizing, or doing any of that. But I was a very keen observer of what was going on. And as I said, told Dr. Raziuddin that I am writing a short monograph on this. So I did have my own academic interest in watching what was going on, and which I did do so very keenly.
So based upon your deep understanding of the system and what's going on right now, if you were to predict what would the Supreme Court's ruling would be, what would it be? Where do you think this is going?
You have asked perhaps the most interesting, important, and difficult question. Well, there can be two aspects, but it is a very interesting question. There can be two aspects of it. If we go by the record of the Supreme Court in the past few years, and particularly in the last 2 to 3 years, the Supreme Court's record does not leave room for much optimism, because on several cases they found ways of somehow supporting the government stand. But this is a very different kind of issue, because as I said, this is something which strikes at the heart of the Constitution. And the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court as the guardian of the Constitution, as the protector of the Constitution, will be called upon to really be mindful of its role as a guardian of the Constitution And after all, the Indian Constitution has been so often described as a charter for equality. And if it is a charter for equality, then this particular Citizenship Amendment Act strikes at that, undermines that charter. And I think it is incumbent on the Supreme Court to really question this, and in a way, I think strike it down. And also, I think what also leaves, gives, I mean, there is some ground for optimism, because several state governments have said that they would not implement it. So even if the Supreme Court upholds it, there will still be constitutional issues that will have to be sorted out, because if several state governments still insist on not implementing it. But as I said, at the moment, it is really difficult to say. Normally, I would have said that this is, this is a case where the Supreme Court would reject such a discriminatory law. But I must say, given the series of verdicts that the Supreme Court has given on several issues, I mean, I can think of so many issues that the Supreme Court should be taking up, which it hasn't. For example, the whole issue of Article 370. It's been more than 1 year, and the Supreme Court hasn't taken these cases. Habeas corpus, it just kept postponing habeas corpus petitions. Electoral bonds, one of the most important issues that is before the Supreme Court. It's been there for more than a year, and not to speak of the bizarre verdict in the Ayodhya case. So there are so many different, there's so many issues on which the Supreme Court has surprised us. And therefore, as I said, it's an open question. But this is different, because really speaking, this is something that strikes at the heart of the Constitution, and the Supreme Court cannot, it would be difficult, I think, for the Supreme Court to ignore this.
Thank you. So there are 2 more questions, and time permitting, I will ask a question, and Dr. Raziuddin will wrap up. Ashok Saab is raising hand, so maybe. Okay, the next person is Dr. Aftab Ansari.
Thank you. So my question actually was answered. It did not escape me that 2 of Raziuddin family grandchildren, are being trained in social sciences by attending.
By listening.
Yes, I noticed that too.
Yes. And as you know,
indeed.
One Raziuddin's daughter is a social scientist, a very good one at that. I just wanted to find out, Zoya, what is the status of the intervention from UN that was being attempted by the UN chief at that time, rights chief, in March or April?
I mean, I won't be able to recall the details, but I do remember reading that they did caution the government against it. And of course, the government of India, as it responds in all such cases, immediately said that, this is an internal matter. But I think it was significant and not just the UN, several other international bodies have also expressed concern, because this is, after all, a matter of citizenship. This is not, this is not even like the Ayodhya case or the electoral bonds case or even the Kashmir. Now, of course, Kashmir is an international issue. But so this is something which is something so basic that I think several, and the discrimination is in your face, and which is why along with the UN, several other international bodies and human rights bodies and so on have taken a stand against the CAA.
And another question comes to mind is,
and possibly I might say I was arguing that it is the it is the protests which have stalled implementation. It's possible to argue that the international reaction, which has been so adverse against the CAA, might be another factor in sort of going slow on framing the rules and so on with regard to the CAA.
yeah, another interesting thing you told us is that the protests actually have stopped the translation of the law into rules.
Well, the rules have not been framed.
So that
yet.
is encouraging. I wonder if you could tell us something about what kind of a structure exists in India to file cases like Supreme Court cases, or is it done randomly by someone, or there are organizations that take the lead role in such cases?
Both. I mean, both. In this case, several individuals have taken it up. But yes, both can do it. Organizations can also do it. In this case, I can't immediately recall whether any particular organization has also petitioned. But several leading activists, politicians have petitioned the Supreme Court. But yes, in this case, the Indian Union of Muslim League has. So there is an organization as well which has petitioned the Supreme Court.
Thank you, Professor Hasan.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Iltifat raised the hand. I don't see him anymore. So Iltifat, are you there? If not, please move on to Ashok Saab. Please be brief. And unfortunately, I have one more question from Pratap Chandra, and that would be the last question. And Dr. Raziuddin will wrap up, and I will sacrifice my question.
Dr. Hasan, thank you very much for your wonderful performance. My interest in this subject was very keen, being a former student of political science at University of Delhi. And Professor Rajendra, the father of Pratap, was my class fellow at that time. And my question to you is, what now? Because Supreme Court is going to take their own time in scheduling this on their calendar. So what now? The item has died, the demonstrations are not there anymore, and there is already a restriction that demonstration should not affect the traffic over there or the main roads. So do you think there's a need,
Yes.
to restart those demonstrations?
Yes, I mean, we've already discussed this, that this is the time to restart. Perhaps, obviously, given the Supreme Court's recent verdict just last week, which was unfortunate in many ways, because the Supreme Court is now almost saying that protests have to take place in a particular place, and you cannot have a Shaheen Bagh type of protest. So perhaps that kind of protest would be difficult, but and certainly not maybe for that length of time, as was the case with the Shaheen Bagh protests. But yes, I think protests are possible, but whether protests will be revived in the same way remains to be seen, even though, of course, we do certainly need protests. And also, I think we should also keep in mind that there are three sets of issues. One is the CAA, which is before the Supreme Court. Then there is the NRC and the NPR. And in a way, it is the NRC which is even more problematic. So I expect that if the NRC will be extended, I don't know if it will, but were it to be extended to the rest of the country, there's every chance that there will be a significant revival of protest, because that is really the most problematic part of this triangle, so to speak.
Thank you very much. I would like to see more Dadimas come forward.
Definitely. I think we all would.
Thank you, Batraji.
Thank you very much.
Next person or the last person is Pratap Chandra Saab. Pratap Saab. Please unmute yourself. I don't see your name the screen. Pratap Saab, try to unmute.
It is there.
He's there.
He's there.
Okay.
Pratap Chandra Behra.
Yeah, I see that. I'm trying to unmute him. If sometimes they cannot unmute themselves. Pratap Chandra here. Okay, unmute.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
good.
Good evening. I wrote my question in the chat box, but I'm reading it again.
Please go ahead.
What I wrote here is, I can see more of spontaneity in this protest, the Shine-Bagh protest. So that's quite visible. Yeah. How much of it is planned? Madam, I wrote the question. I am reading it again.
Yeah.
Okay, let me see.
I can see more of spontaneity in this protest. That is quite visible. How much of it is planned or organized? And if so, what next?
I mean, what next? I'm not in a position really. So many of you have asked this question. I'm really not in a position, not being involved in any way in this movement. Can't really answer that. But the spontaneity, the other two things, which spontaneity and the planning part, I think you've stated yourself that this was fairly spontaneous. But at the same time, it's also quite evident that something so large and so widespread as this can't be just spontaneous. There was obviously some planning. But the interesting thing is that political parties were not actively planning it, or at least there's no, now they may be doing things in the background, but they were certainly not up front. So this was very much a civil society initiative, civil society movement, probably backed by some semi-political organization. So spontaneous, yes, but some amount of planning, because without that, this scale of movement would not happen and could not have been sustained for as long as it was sustained.
Thank you, Chandra ji.
Rafat, you please ask your question.
Yeah.
Please ask your question.
I had a similar question as Dr. Pratap Chandra, somehow similar. But I have a different question, a very, very different question, and some people may not like it. That the movements or the protests I see most of them end up being failure. I see here in the United States, Black movement is taking so long, although people say the progress is made, but it is not as quick as someone would desire. And same thing, the Indian government was waiting for, that the CA movement will die on its own. Although there was a very vibrant movement, but it died kind of because of the COVID. So I don't know whether it will yield any good results in the end. And that is my comment, or you can consider a question, whatever, because I don't see much hope except there was a movement.
Well, there are two things. One is a positive outcome of a movement. And in this case, there was a very specific demand, which was withdraw this movement. Now, that may or may not happen, and especially if the Supreme Court were to uphold it, then of course that is the law then. But I think if you're looking at it as a movement, I think the movement was significant, because after all, this was a movement against discrimination. Now, discrimination is something which is much wider, and it goes beyond CAA. The fact that so many people were protesting against discrimination, I think, is important in itself. So I wouldn't say, I mean, every movement does not end in a positive outcome. I mean, after all, movements bring people together, they mobilize support, they democratize society. So all of that, I mean, mass mobilization has an important democratic purpose. And I think this movement was hugely successful in fulfilling that democratic purpose of deepening democracy through mass mobilization.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. But there was a 1 million people march here in the US against the Iraq war, but they still went for the war. So, okay, Razi bhai, please wrap up.
All right. There was a demand that the last word should come also from Professor Robila Thapar, but she just happened to she just left. So I cannot say anything now. So anyway, can I ask, I mean, this is the last question probably.
You are always entitled to ask question and wrap up.
It's not entitled. See, there is a lot of things happen back home in India or in third world when there is a political climate change in US. So under Trump, obviously, the present government in India, yeah. So the present government in India had a lot of free hand to go whatever, because they got a similar kind here, and there is a chance. Nobody knows, but there is a feeling that perhaps the Democrats will come back in some way. So if the Biden presidency comes, which is sort of extension of Obama's presidency, and Obama did do a lot of cheating in Delhi at that time. So do you think that this Shaheen Bagh type movements will come back and they will feel more empowered because of a change in Washington?
No, I don't think the movement or people will feel empowered, but it is possible that the government will be under pressure from a Biden-Kamala Harris government. Now that so I think the issue is not whether that, I don't think the Trump's defeat will embolden people, but it could impact the government. So that is how I look at it. Although the India-US strategic embrace right now is so deep that possibly a change of government is not going to alter the strategic partnership between India and the US very significantly. But I do think that if the Democrats win and if you have Kamala Harris as the vice president, then given her own track record, I would expect that she would take a stand on this issue as well. So that's what it is. But I don't think that's going to give a hand to the protesters. But yes, I mean, the atmospherics will change, the dynamics will change, and in that sense, yes, it will in a way act as a restraint on the government, on the